Hello, everyone, and welcome to the fourth episode of the Let's Get Real podcast. On today's episode, we'll be discussing the documentary film genre, specifically focusing on the 1970 documentary Gimme Shelter, as we bring in Dr. Wyatt Phillips from the Film Studies Department here at the Texas Tech University to help provide us with a lot more insight on the history of the genre, along with the various styles of documentary filmmaking. So let's get this one going. Hey guys, what's up? This is Let's Get Real podcast. Today it's only going to be me and Bryce. Bailey and Jonah are actually out on a baseball game, and hopefully they're not getting rained out today. But today we have Dr. Phillips with us. He is a professor here at Tech, and he does. Sorry, Professor Phillips, can you remind me of that again?
Sure, I teach. No, it's all good. Film and Media Studies in the English department.
Perfect. So
Awesome.
he'll be here talking with us about the history of documentary films, and we'll actually go ahead and get started with that. So the word documentary was derived from the French word documentary. I'm going to try to put
Documentary.
Documentaire.
Yeah.
by the Scottish educator by the name of John Greeson. Documentaries have been present as early as the 1900s. In fact, the Lumiere brothers' first ever attempt at filmmaking were all documentary style films. The first official documentary was a narrative by Robert Flattery titled Nanook of the North. This was an ethnographic look into the life of Inuit Eskimos living in the Arctic. This gave Robert Flattery the title of father of the documentary films. An interesting note. Oh yeah, go ahead.
Yeah, let me jump in. No, it's great because so the Lumiere brothers, their father owned and ran a photographic factory, picture photo camera in the late 19th century in France. So their framework was all the kinds of things that you would take pictures of with a regular camera. So their very first films were these very sort of home movie style, what we would call now home movies, right? Which are documents, clear documentaries of our own experience. And so it's totally framed through that. And then, but the other early films too, they called them actualities because it was actual life rather than fictional narrative stuff. But when it comes across and say Edison, who's in New York City, he's actually based in New Jersey, right across the Hudson. His frame of reference isn't cameras, photo cameras, picture cameras. It's the New York City stage. So all of his early documentary style actualities were documenting things that were taking place on that New York City, on the New York City
theater
stage.
Yeah,
exactly. Vaudeville.
In one of my
classes. So there's this real history of the way that things that existed in other media get transposed to cinema early on, depending on what the filmmaker was familiar with. Even early films get called, in some cases, virtual newspapers, because there were these traveling showmen that had worked with basically slide projectors for years, stereo opticons, and now they could have films integrated into these little history lessons or into these current event stories, what's going on in the world, which was interesting to people in small towns across the country who didn't have access to even big city newspapers, much less any kind of video. So and ethnography was just one of those other things, depending on what the person who wanted to make the film was interested in. So Flaherty comes from a longer tradition of ethnography that used cameras and manual recording, handwritten stuff, and they just integrated the films into that. On 19 film cameras where people had never taken them before, like the Inuit Inuit tribes there in northern Canada. So
kind of showing people what they're missing out on.
Yeah, I mean, you can imagine that people were interested in the photos from these places, but now you're bringing back video, like film, and you go to the movie theater to watch it, and you're like, wow. But he's using the structure of narrative cinema. Right? 90 minutes is what becomes normalized in the late teens. Mostly because that's what also is normalized on the stage. That's about an evening's worth of entertainment, and so he uses that format. But there's not these real for Flaherty. There's not these real restrictions in terms versus fiction. And
Mhm.
so a film like Nanook of the North is interesting because he's recreating, right? The way we think about reality television, staging sequences, he's
Mhm.
doing that in the late teens, early 20s
Oh,
with
wow.
this character. And he's telling a history of the Inuits that's actually largely passed by that point. They've been
Mhm.
exposed to Western people for, decades. And he has this character recreate what he remembers, the seal hunt and things like that. Mostly they just traded with, the Anglo folk by that point, but he's recreating this experience because that's a more potent story
Mhm.
for the audiences, right?
Yeah.
So he's already doing things that we think come very late to documentary, which is massaging the truth,
Mm.
Mhm.
right at the beginning. So there wasn't this clean break, or veracity or honesty or whatever, and storytelling and narrative, which again we find wedded all the time now, but even back then at the beginning, before there was this sort of uh, split. So Grierson comes in. He's a British, Scottish, but British filmmaker during the Depression, and he's working more or less for the British government, making these documentaries that then become propaganda,
Yeah.
right? So looking at America, The Plow That Broke the Plains, funded by Roosevelt, the president at the time, so that he could, or the government could justify to the people why we need to build these dams. Why do we need to use all of this economic power of America to build dams on these rivers? Well, that's what the plow that broke the plains is largely arguing for. So they become about, they start to move towards propaganda, honestly. But in the Depression, nobody really cares
Mm.
because you're arguing for things that are trying to uplift society. Even if you disagree with the means, the ideas are there. Make you
Mhm.
proud of your region or your country or whatever. Um,
Support the troops.
Yeah.
well, that's the next stage, right? Because then at the
Yeah.
end, what stops the Depression is World War II.
Yeah.
And so then support the troops, right? There is that sort of triumphantness, but there's also the potential for propaganda in the negative sense. So if you look at a film, Leni Riefenstahl in Germany is making films at the behest of the Nazi government, and those are very much about why the Nazi government is to be supported. They're
Mhm.
rah-rah films for them, and from our perspective in the West, in America, those look like pure propaganda. But of course, if you're on looking from their perspective at the films that then American try, the Why We Fight series, these are propaganda too. So propaganda in some ways is just a function of perspective, but it's also a function of argument. You're trying to make an argument more than you're trying to just say chase after the truth. So get more, and audiences start to see
Sorry.
that
I'm
the
so
film
sorry.
form is something that can be manipulated, right? So
Mhm.
That
I'm
last
just I'm just running I'm just running ahead, but
No, no, you're good, you're good.
uh,
That last part, if you could actually repeat it. I'm so sorry. My computer's lagging on my end. But
oh sure. Um, so as how far back do you want me to go?
uh well, and you just said
Doesn't matter.
Okay.
so basically it was just the war on between, not the war, but like the back and forth of the triumph of will versus why
Oh,
we fight. So that
sure.
part of
Oh.
history there that documentaries took, like you said, with the propaganda, um
Yeah, no.
on that take.
So yeah, so so in the Depression, these documentaries, which are full of particular arguments and perspectives, are all sort of there to just lift up whether it's Britain or the U.S. or whatever, and so there's not really they're propaganda, but they're not the kind of thing that we think about, at least at that point, in terms of propaganda, which is trying to deceive somebody into thinking something that's not true or that's false or that's slight, whatever. Um, and so though, as you get the beginnings of World War II, which is of course what ends the Great Depression, you start to see films like Triumph of the Will and Olympia, which are films that Leni Riefenstahl makes for Germany, for the German government, that are really just Nazi propaganda. Um, and that was their intent, and it's also the result.
Yeah.
So, and of course, though, from from the perspective of the Nazi government, right, that's a good thing. Just like if you come across the pond to the U.S. during World War II and you look at the Why We Fight series,
Mhm.
It's very sort of uplift the country, uplift the morale of the people, reinforce the reasons why we're doing something. Been propagated out of World War II, audiences are now really aware that film form that they always recognize could be sort of manipulated to tell stories effectively can also be manipulated in the documentary to twist the truth, or at least readjust where this discussion is going, again, for the sake of propaganda. And so they become, for a period, pretty resistant to the style of documentary, right? So you still have news reportage, you still have the sort of news shows at the movie theater before you have television that becomes the sort of site of the nightly news or weekly news or whatever. But people become suspicious of that kind of documentary form. And so when you move a decade later into the late 50s and early 60s, documentary filmmakers also are aware that there's this like resistance, right?
Barrier.
Yeah. So they have to find a different way to tell. If you want to make a documentary and you know that people are resistant to that mode that looks like propaganda, you got to find another way to do it. And so you get a couple of historical sort of forms of the documentary that come up. One, and these are just West, right? So the one in France and one in North America, US and Canada. The French one's called cinema verite, right? Truth cinema. So they're going back to this question of how can we get the truth, right? Documentaries can be used for propaganda, but let's not do that. Let's use them to get at the truth. And direct cinema similarly is after similar questions. But what they both do, interestingly, is they take this ethnographic impulse, which is there with Flaherty and even before, not in cinema so much, but in other forms. And they take that camera, though, which has been used now since Flaherty in the early 20s. So we're talking about 30 years, been used to observe often what was then called third world countries or indigenous populations in other places besides the West. And they turn it back on their own society, right? So they take those same techniques and they say, well, what happens if we look at ourselves through that same perspective, that same lens? And of course, now you also have all of those 16 millimeter cameras that were produced for World War II footage, both for things like Why We Fight, but also for the military to be able to get access to images on the front and then ship them back home. There's a bunch of these cameras.
Handheld ones, correct? Like they're just like
exactly. And it's lightweight and it's mobile, right? In a way that 35 millimeter cameras weren't specifically in the 40s. And those are now on the open market. So a lot of filmmakers have taken that on. So you see avant-garde cinema as well as documentary cinema, as well as independent cinema, what before the sort of 90s version, all really explodes after World War II, partly because of the technologies available and it's lightweight and it's cheaper to do 16 than 35. So there's all these reasons.
So everyone was playing with that field now that it was readily available to the mass public.
Yeah, or certainly more available. It's still expensive in relation to what we have now with digital technology. But so these filmmakers, again, cinema verite in France and direct cinema, again, in US and Canada, people like Robert Drew and D.A. Pennebaker, and ultimately the Maisel brothers, who do, they all pick it up. Documentary, but in a kind of French way, they play the provocateur. They sort of present themselves as just watching, but then the filmmaker will ask these sort of poignant questions, looking to get an emotional response. They don't really care what kind of response. They don't have necessarily a goal in mind. They're ethnographic in impulse. They're just watching to see what it is about the society. But they're not content to just watch. They're poking, right? Provocateur. But here on this side, the impulse becomes very much what's later called fly on the wall. Let's just watch and watch and watch and watch and watch, and something interesting is going to happen at some point. But if you look at the films that they make, they follow musicians, like famous musicians, not nobodies. They follow Kennedy when he's running for the primary election. They follow salesmen. They ultimately, you know, they look at what we think of now as sort of these crisis potential.
Yeah.
The logic of crisis, and they put themselves somewhere where they think probably something is going to happen as a result.
You're going to get some action because it's guaranteed. Yeah,
something's gonna blow up.
Yeah,
because that leads into like the documentary of choice that we have, and that this was your recommendation, but it was Gimme Shelter, and like from the get-go of watching this, you can kind of feel the turmoil like just building up. That's what we really liked about it.
Something's going to go sideways at some point. You just don't know when, and you don't know what that's going to mean. And and that all of these are like that. Grey Gardens, which the Maisels do a few years later. Two of these really eccentric, I don't know if you've seen it, relatives of Jackie Kennedy Onassis that live out on Long Island in this really old house with tons of cats, right? At some point, something's going to fold in on itself. And of course it does. But yeah, the moments, these logic of crisis, and they kind of recreate the 3-act structure around that crisis moment. Well, again, as a documentary filmmaker, you know, you don't know what's going to happen, but they're putting themselves in a place, in a situation where they expect something might
go wrong or have a problem. They're ready to capture it.
Yeah. And, you know, of course, that's not the end all. This is, again, we talked about that transformation from World War II and propaganda into this direct because the sites, right? PBS in the 70s becomes really important. And then again, and even more so in the 80s, as a site for where these kinds of sort of personal documentaries go, or where they're, and so you're targeting audiences differently. You're thinking about your reception differently as a documentary filmmaker. So the model changes. Some still imagine or hope for theatrical distribution. You know, so you have some of these names that come through the 80s, like Errol Morris and Michael Moore, some of whom are still making documentary films. And then as you move forward into the 90s, the technologies of editing get easier, so you can shoot more and handle it more quickly. Then you get digital cameras, and that changes it, so it's not so selective. There's some really great documentaries through the 70s and 80s, but still it's expensive. Think about the hours of footage that documentary film requires. Even at 16, that could be a sizable investment. And you get to digital, and that's like, you know, okay, now we're nickels on the dollar for what we used to spend as documentary filmmakers. So both the volume and the range, these things, you know, in some ways explode. Cable television in the 80s needs content, so it becomes a site. The History Channel, you know, when those things begin, and a lot of people I think today are familiar with documentaries through the History Channel, because it's always there in every cable package, and you always have to flip past it.
Kind of educational, but entertainment in a sense, but like not really educational in a sense. But and that kind of, again, like that leads into the next topic of our podcasting, which is just discussing more on Gimme Shelter and kind of our thoughts on it. So again, watching this, we're, like we said, we grew up with that generation knowing documentary as a interview, and what was it that you said, kind of provoking an action or something, like you want to get your point across. And watching this purely as a fly on the wall, I felt like Bryce kind of said it pretty well. It was like just being in the moment with it, and just kind of feeling the tension as it went along. And like when it finally happened, like, oh my God, like I was watching it, my wife was watching with me, and she said, oh my God, did that guy just get stabbed? And I was like, yeah, like that's all about. And like, it was just crazy. What was your thoughts on it, Bryce, as you were watching this?
Oh, the whole time I was watching it, all these people like there to watch them, and they're all tripping out on drugs and going crazy. I'm like, wow, the 70s were nuts. I've heard stories, but now I'm here, and this is what it's like. It was just, it was just a lot. Yeah, people like, want some Molly, LSD, hash. I'm like, okay, this is, and you feel like you're there because you're like eye level and looking around. But it was definitely like a fresh change, because I'm used to like interview one-on-one type of documentaries, and this one was just you were just there the whole time watching everything happen as it's going.
Yeah, it's a different experience to be that kind of like just dropped in again, that fly on the wall. And here, like I said, so when this film came out in 1970, it was shot in December of '69. So and so audiences would have known about Altamont Speedway. It would have been in the news, right? Imagine it, being about something that happened,
like COVID.
COVID,
Yeah.
right? You're very familiar, but this is a privileged vantage point in a way that you didn't get these kind of privileged vantage points. Everybody didn't have a film camera in their pocket, right? It was completely different. But today, you don't necessarily, so over the course of from 70 to 2020, I mean, we're talking about 50 years, people aren't familiar with Altamont Speedway. So that name doesn't ring a bell necessarily. So you're not hyper aware from the beginning that this is a tragedy unfolding in front of you. But like you said, you can feel the tension in the space, both through the filmmaking and just for the fact that following the Stones around for some number of weeks has got to be crazy in 1969.
Yeah.
I love that scene where they're coming out of the Holiday Inn in like Alabama, and Jagger's wearing this white outfit with this red, like you are. It's not like, yeah. But the Altamont Speedway it's a tragic end to the '60s. It's in December, the last month of the '60s, and so I'm sorry, I just blanked. The music festival in New York in August of '69, right? This is where I'm blanking.
Can't remember all the dates, but
no, it's the big one. It's the one that everybody knows. The big music fest in the late '60s, Woodstock.
Oh yeah.
Okay, sorry.
You're good.
Burning Man.
Yeah, I'll pick that up.
Okay, yeah.
So, Altamont Speedway is this tragic end to 1969, to the 1960s, which had been this sort of increased idealism of the baby boom generation. Even though you've got all these horrific things, assassinations, the Vietnam War going on around you, there's a certain idealized view that things are getting better, coming out of civil rights and moving into sort of youth power. And Woodstock in August of '69 is this moment of like celebration of these ideas and these ideals through music, but also through the experience. And they say in Gimme Shelter at one point, like, this is going to be the best experience of 1969. The implicit like contrast there is, or comparison is to Woodstock.
But well, even like going off of that, like what I like about because there's that one part where Mick Jagger's like, guys, we're supposed to not be doing this.
Yeah, right? It's like, let's not fight.
He's like super bummed about it. Yeah. And, like the chaos is just erupting. He's like, we're supposed to have peace, and like they're all like, yo, peace.
Yeah. Another one thought was interesting is there was actually like people for the Black Panthers there, like talking about that. And I was like, okay, wow, this really sets like this isn't a recreation. This is it. This is actually, you're watching this live.
Sort of like slugged out white girl passing out those flyers.
Yeah.
Black Panther. Like just seeing that was kind of like what Joe or Bryce was saying. I'm sorry, but how like it was just so, not surreal, but like just seeing these people like really like they were gone. They were gone, and like they were in the groove of the concert, and like even the dude I think who got stabbed, like he seemed like he was in the groove of things, and like his groove was just cut, and that's when the tragedy happened.
Earlier.
Yeah, because he was.
Right before this. I mean, they've been setting it up for a while. You've been on that stage with them, right, for like 10 minutes in film time, much less in real time. But it seems like the way they cut it, that there's as much time spent talking to the crowd about settling down as there is actually performing. And you get this really weird tension with Mick Jagger keep going, like, everybody sit down, settle down, and then going right back into Jumping Jack Flash, which is like super high energy. So there's this weird kind of like force fit that they're trying to do, have it both ways in some ways, right? But right before they cut to the stabbing, you've got that guy over on the right side of the stage just out of his mind, and they stay on him for like a minute and a half, really long, so that you get a sense of where everybody is. And of course, they've already been slowly building up the point that you have the Hells Angels acting as the like physical blockade from the crowd. And if you've ever been to a concert before COVID, right, these big like, arena concerts, they always have this like 10 yards of blocked off space between the crowd and the performers. And this is why. I mean, because they have they couldn't hire the police to do it. They wouldn't do it. So they hired, or it was too expensive. So they hired the Hells Angels. And the guy on the phone at the beginning is like, we were just told we could sit at the edge of the stage and drink beer and listen all day, right? With this idea that all of these peace-loving hippies would respect that distance, right? That they're going to allow a couple of big burly men to block them from getting access to Mick Jagger and Keith Richards and the Rolling Stones. And of course, that might be fine if everybody's perfectly sober and in the right mind. But as soon as, and it's not even then, you see some people early on who are like trying to get access and getting thrown off the stage beforehand. And they may be in their right mind as far as drugs go, but they're not in their right mind as far as like star fixation.
Yeah.
And you mix drugs and, oh my God. And then it's just, I mean, it's this cocktail that's going to explode.
Yeah.
But the fact that they capture the stabbing, right? And that scene where they roll back the footage and you've got the gun against the crochet. When I first watched this movie, it was on this really crappy television. It was about the size of my 13-inch monitor here I'm looking at you guys on. And we couldn't really see it.
I was like, what is that?
It was on a VHS tape on a crappy television. We couldn't really, we had to kind of trust that David Maisel's voiceover was accurate.
Yeah.
And obviously it is.
Well, I was even like looking for like how now in documentaries they circle it for you, and I was like,
oh yeah,
I was like, where's it at? Like, what am I supposed to?
Yeah, like, what am I looking for?
No, but being able to capture that, and I mean, they just had Karen. And if you look at the end, there's a list of everybody that was. So Albert Maisels is the main brother that does the camera work through most of it, and then for the concert, they sent out basically a call for anybody in the Bay Area that wanted to come up. And so you see a couple of names for a few people that went on to be career filmmakers. George Lucas, for example, is in that list. Another one, Joan Churchill, who went on to make a number of documentaries in the 80s and 90s. So yeah, I mean, this is 69 and they were, Lucas was of age, but it was just, the timing is really great for this, but in that sense, but they have all these cameras. So they're really able to choose and somebody on stage happened to be like pointing the camera at that thing at that moment and magic.
Yep. The rocket finally lit and they finally got fireworks.
They got big fireworks. And you think about the way they could have done this too, just through that fly on the wall, which was the tradition that they'd grown up in, right? Through the 60s with Pennebaker and Drew and direct cinema. But they didn't, the Maisel brothers and Charlotte Zwerg, who's the editor primarily, didn't feel like that was adequate. Like it wasn't going to be able to get the point across. So you get that reflexivity of watching the Stones in the editing room, right? They're watching and going back and forth. You get a reaction shot of Mick Jagger watching the footage of the murder that he was there at. It's like,
yeah.
But it's amazing and it's so effective.
Paused it on him, like where they pause it and they kind of like zoom in on him and you kind of see like
his face just
kind of like the turmoil within his face of like this just happened. But that was the part that I really liked on that. Like just I didn't understand it like at first, but then I kind of figured so
when I first started it, I thought it was just a bad song or something that they didn't like, and he was just like, this song sucks. But I was like, oh wait. Then
But on that thought, is there any? So again, me and Bryce were saying that we love this documentary. So is there any other recommendations of documentary films that kind of within the fly on the wall?
That sure. There's two out of this period that I really like. One's "Don't Look Back" by D.A. Pennebaker, which follows Bob Dylan in a 1965 concert tour of the UK. And it's sort of, it would be one of those sort of first behind the scenes kind of what we now think of like those expose. But he's cold and he's really in like media mode and they're getting access to him and the idea that like where does the persona and the performance, like
Me.
it's pretty clear that there's maybe not a difference for him, and
Hmm.
it's pretty amazing. And then there's another one I mentioned earlier by the Maisel brothers called Grey Gardens, which again follows these two eccentric relatives of Jackie Kennedy Onassis that live out in this like dilapidated mansion on Long Island and are surrounded by, I mean, it's everything you would imagine and more. But you know, the way that they privilege here the relationship with the sound, the brother that does sound, David Maisels, and you see him in that editing room with Mick Jagger, right? And he's talking. There's a shot there where it's clear that the younger of the two women is playing for the camera. So even though you have this, the idea being the longer the camera is there, the more it disappears from the consciousness of the people that are in front of the camera. It actually becomes the other. She starts to perform for the cameraman, and she starts to get a relationship with the person who's operating the camera, and that becomes clear in her modalities. And so the filmmakers foreground it just like they do here. There's a swish pan that's not that swishy, where he stops on his own reflection in the mirror holding the camera, and so you get that reflexivity again of this is a documentary, but the documentarians aren't fully extricated from it, differently than in Gimme Shelter, but to a similar end. And so again, you get that shift in direct cinema into something else. And then it changes again. Like I said, in the 70s, you get an uptick in political or politicized documentary filmmaking, coal miners unions and stuff like that. And then into PBS and sort of a regionalism. And it just keeps changing because audiences, it's just like genre. You've been talking about genre all semester, yeah? You know, if you look at the way that genre changes over time, the way the horror film was one thing in the 50s and different in the 70s and different again in the 90s and now different than that, right? Documentaries do the same. They're interested in something different beyond just storytelling. But audiences, filmmakers, innovation, technology, culture, right? You know, what is the culture interested in and concerned with that's going to drive people to watch something in a documentary form? That changes. So
Do you think this type of documentary will come back eventually, or
I think it's still here. It's just a piece of everything else. So when I teach documentary in my intro course, English 2388, I teach Blackfish, this documentary on the killer whales.
Shamu,
right? Yeah. And so that one's like a mixed mode. It has that sort of talking head that you were to earlier. But there's moments when it's just watching these people that had been working in SeaWorld during that time. And now they've come together again to sort of reflect on this moment. Those are observational documentaries. You're just watching them engage with each other. They take them out on a boat and they're looking at like orcas in the wild and their like expressions on their face. Well, that's fly on the wall stuff. So it's rare that it exists in like a tip to tail kind of style now. But
I would say that I actually just recently watched one called The Dawn Wall. And that one is very much, I feel like, well, the way that you described it was kind of like how I forget his name, but basically it's this rock climber and they follow along with him, and he it's just fly on the wall too. Like you kind of get his, which I don't know how they did this, but they were literally on the side of the wall with him as they're like recording.
Oh yeah.
They get his reactions and stuff, and it's very fly on the wall, and that's why I was engaged with it, because I like that kind of style of just
right there.
Yeah, you're right there, and like literally, I'm just thinking, how did they do this? But it was awesome, yeah.
And I feel like those type of documentaries, like the actual people filming it, they put themselves in that, and then they become part of the documentary. Like, just like in Gimme Shelter, when he was in the mirror, it became at that moment it became less of like me feeling like I was there, more like I felt like I was there, but I was also the one filming. Like, I don't know. Yeah.
No, I mean, that's what it's supposed to do. It's supposed to, you know, put you right there and you're just watching along with them. And so again, there will be moments and topics, Josh, like you're talking about, where that's really the most effective way to tell this story, to build the tension that the individual is feeling, or that's in that moment. Just drop a camera in. And of course, the technologies are radically different now. You know, they could have been, I mean, currently, depending on when that film was made, you could have been there with a drone
Yeah.
filming it, right? And you're safe, but you have that kind of privileged access to a rock climber on a wall all by himself. I think in that case, there was actually somebody strapped in, like not free climbing, but with ropes that was adjacent to him, which is a sports documentary convention that goes back to things like the Warren Miller skiing documentaries that start in the 60s that kind of come out of the same impetus of something like Endless Summer, the surfing documentary, right? So yeah, those traditions can, and again, depends on what you're doing. Now there's so many different modalities of documentary that audiences accept, but there's still conventions, right? You get a sense when you watch a documentary that it's not like reality TV, even though in many ways they're both working off a script, they both have privileged access. Sometimes they ask people to do things more than once in order to catch it more effectively, but there's a difference in terms of what they're after and what they're trying to do. And so these things that exist all the way back in the 20s, like they're loose boundaries, they're gray areas of separation, but there's still some degree of separation in terms of how we think about them. So those are two. I mean, what's great about documentaries is it like whatever you're into.
Yeah.
In the last, I don't know, 3 months or so, I've watched 3 different, I think they were all on Netflix, but one was the Michael Jordan.
Yeah.
I hadn't seen it when it was originally released. I just watched it all, like, there was one on ZZ Top that was like 4 or 5 years old, but Netflix just put it up. And then there was one called Battered Bastards of Baseball,
I remember,
which was about Kurt Russell's dad, the actor Kurt Russell. His dad was also a Hollywood actor, but in the early 70s, he bought a baseball team in Portland, Oregon, and made them into the only, at that point, independent baseball team in America. Everybody else was under the Major League Baseball, like, mid-structure minor league. And they were extremely successful, but they were off the wall wacky, and not always in a good way. But that brought, I didn't even know that I knew Kurt Russell had been a baseball player, kind of, but I didn't know anything about his dad until I watched it, and that helps me understand a little bit about Kurt Russell's son that just played John Walker in Falcons and Winter Soldier, right? And he was a hockey player before he went into acting, like full on, about 10 years ago. So yeah, this relationship, anyway, documentaries are great.
Wrap it up. Sorry, I just saw the time. We usually do this. This is what we always do with the Let's Get Real podcast, and we're going to give a rating to this documentary. Like I said, watching this, I'm just fully captivated the whole time from start to finish. So I'm definitely giving this a 10 out of 10. I loved it. I'm probably going to rewatch it just because, like you said, there's a lot of things that you can miss and want to just catch again. So, Bryce, what was your rating for this documentary?
I think I'm going to definitely give it like a 9.8. I think it's definitely stole my favorite documentary just because I haven't seen this style before, so it was like kind of life-changing. I was like, wow, this is really cool. I want to watch more like this.
Yeah.
So I'm gonna give it 9.8. It could be a 10. I haven't seen any others like it, but I'm gonna go and watch these other ones and then maybe come back with another review. But 9.8 for right now.
Great. I've seen this. So I've seen this a number of times. I've seen it on the big screen. I played it at the Alamo here once 5 or 6 years ago. But to end on a high note, I'll borrow a line from a mockumentary, Spinal Tap, and I'll say my rating goes to 11. So
I agree with that. So that'll do it for us here on the Let's Get Real podcast. Be sure to follow us on Facebook at facebook.com/LGRpod or on Twitter at Real Nation Talk, or visit us on our website at www.letsgetreal.net. For Bryce Beavers, Jonah Young, and Bailey C., I'm Josh Silva saying so long and see you next time here on the Let's Get Real podcast.